Aloha everyone, it's Ajanette and I am here to cover your Module 3 lecture on Infancy and Toddlerhood. So we're going to start out as usual by covering physical development. And in infancy, the average weight of a baby is 7.5 pounds and 20 inches long. They actually lose weight in the first few days of their lives, and many people don't know that. So it's perfectly normal and healthy. If you are in fact breastfeeding, then they get colostrum, which is very nutrient rich. It's kind of the precursor to breast milk, but it gives them all the nutrients and antibodies they need for those first few days. So don't stress too much. You don't actually have to supplement with formula. The colostrum is sufficient for them. And the more that they nurse, the more it's going to stimulate the breast milk production. So be patient with the process. But overall, they will continue to gain weight once they start eating. And you want to watch for that with the pediatrician to make sure that they are, in fact, getting the nutrients that they need and gaining weight and growing in healthy, wonderful ways. By the time they reach toddlerhood, and they're toddling around, they're going to weigh about 20 to 40 pounds at the end of 2. And that's kind of a wide age range. Of course, weight varies by culture, build, structure, and that affects our infants too. So be kind and be gracious. It's okay to see rolls on the babies. It's okay to see fat on the babies. And just actively work with your pediatrician, work with your wellness visits, and you'll know when your baby maybe is a little bit overweight, but otherwise I think that just give babies all the nutrients that they need and they're going to be just fine. So you will notice when the baby's born, like they got this big old bobblehead, right? They're bobblehead babies. And that's because of the cephalocaudal principle, right? Development occurs from the head down. They need that big, beautiful brain to support all the learning that's happening. Everything is brand new. So when an infant comes into this world, their brain is prepared to interact with literally everything. And so that big old bobblehead is important for them. When you, in the womb, you're going to see that bobblehead, that big old head, sometimes it looks like they're all head, right? It's about 50% of the total body size. And it's a little bit smaller when they're born. It's now 25%. And you'll see that cephalocaudal principle when we talk about motor development, because they're going to first learn how to control their head. So cephalocaudal is head to tail, right? So the development was occurring in utero from head to tail, and now control over the muscles and the strength is going to go from head to tail as well. So just a reminder about the neural structures of a neuron, right? You have that soma within the body of the neuron is the nucleus, and that's kind of the center, the processing center. The dendrites are the receiving appendages that pull in the information from the neighboring neurons. They're going to process it here in the nucleus and then send that information down the axon, which carries the messaging away from the soma or the cell body. And it's going to end up down here in the axon terminals that are going to release neurotransmitters that are passed on then to the next neuron. And then around each axon is this myelin sheath. It's a fatty substance that allows that neural impulse to process more quickly and efficiently. I think I likened it to water on the water slide. So that continues to be important in infancy outside of the womb now, in that you're going to start to see this beautiful surge of synaptogenesis occurring, where we actually are going to find synapses forming. We're going to have dendrites stretching out, and at the end of that axon and that dendrite, they're going to be preparing to actually communicate. So they're building the mechanisms and the connections to communicate with one another now, to process all that rich new data that they're experiencing in the world. So this is what's called a time of exuberance in infancy. And that's when those dendrites are like, hey, that's some information. That's new. I want to hear about that. I want to understand that. I want to process that. So you're going to have these dendritic connections happening, and that synaptic space kind of developing the maturity and resources to process that information. You might also hear it referred to as synaptic blooming, just this beautiful neural growth that's happening. Think of the brain like a garden right now, and it's really emerging, and there's sprouts rooting up, and you can see that kind of blossoming happening over those first 2 years of life. The brain is this beautiful, beautiful, rich organ that has the capacity to understand, process, store, organize really endless amounts of information. And when an infant is first born, everything is a new piece of data for them, a new sound, a new taste, a new touch, a new feeling, right? A new visual stimuli. And so all of that requires the brain to respond by developing the mechanisms by which it can understand and organize and retain that information. Now, what's really interesting is our brains are efficient, right? They're like recycling, where they look at, okay, well, are we using all those neural pathways, or are some of them no longer necessary based on the context for this infant? For instance, they're born with the capacity to process any sound in any language, right? But at about 7 months old, if they're not being exposed to those sounds, then the brain goes through and prunes off the unnecessary materials. And so when you prune a rose bush, it allows the remaining branches to thrive, because it now ensures that those nutrients and water and resources are directed to those remaining branches, and it gives them everything they need to really bloom and have a rich, beautiful blossom. And so synaptic pruning happens in the brain, where it prunes away those unused neural pathways so that the remaining can be more efficient. And it's going to be based on experience, by exposure, right? And so pruning isn't something that's just limited to infancy and toddlerhood. It will continue throughout life, but particularly where language is concerned, a lot of that happens in those first couple of years. So in terms of brain size, at birth, the brain is about 25% of what an adult brain is, and by age 2, it's about 75%. And that growth is a reflection of that synaptogenesis and that exuberance happening. It also is a reflection of all the learning that's occurring in those first 2 years. Even though they may not be able to communicate that learning, it's definitely happening. So it's a beautiful time to just watch the richness of the human brain and the human learning process, because you'll watch your child pick up on things, do things, acquire things just so rapidly and quickly. It is absolutely amazing and an awesome experience. So the cortex is that wrinkly substance that we typically visually think of when we think of a brain. It is divided into the 2 hemispheres. So it's not just one big blob, it's actually 2 kind of half blobs put together, similar to like you can peel an orange in half, right? Now you can peel it into smaller segments too, but definitely our brain is segmented into hemispheres or halves. There's also lobes, or areas or regions within each of those hemispheres. And we do experience what's called lateralization, or a specialized process of each half of the brain. So right brain versus left brain thinking. Now, when you're in infancy, you still actually have more, symmetry on both sides, right? But the asymmetrical functions, for instance, moving of the hands on the right hand, is actually controlled on the left side of the brain. So there is some asymmetry or mirroring effect, and you see more of that in infancy. Again, that's kind of the way they're programmed and wired, and then experience will help them develop new wiring because the brain's going to be responsive to that. So the prefrontal cortex is one of the least developed areas in infancy, and that takes time. That continues to develop well into our mid-20s. That area is associated with emotional regulation, impulse control, organization, logical, practical thinking, and our ability to kind of plan out things, to think ahead, right? To be more intentional. And this is why toddlers throw tantrums. And this is why they cry when they're told no or don't get their way, right? They don't have the ability to manage the emotions yet. So to expect an infant or toddler to stop crying or to not respond a certain way is probably not practical. We have to think about their brain development, the cognitive abilities that they have, how they're able to process information, and we want to offer them, of course, appropriate grace given their neural capacity. And then the final concept to think about with brain development is plasticity, or our ability to kind of rewire, to heal, to change. And that continues to happen throughout life, but it actually enjoys more plasticity in infancy and toddlerhood. So if a child does suffer some sort of injury or trauma in the brain in infancy and toddlerhood, the plasticity lends itself to kind of rebuilding and rewiring. And certainly plasticity is going to vary from infant to infant. It's going to be affected by genes and hormones and all these other wonderful, beautiful things that are going to give the brain flexibility and adaptability. But again, variation from person to person. And then finally, in terms of structures, our brain does have lobes or regions, and there's 4 primary lobes. Sometimes we think of the cerebellum as a 5th lobe, but in the front part of our brain here, both on our right and left hemisphere, you have what we call the frontal lobe. And again, this is logic, planning, thought, impulse control. Then our parietal lobe is largely associated with our sensory processing. Actually, our sensory cortex falls right along that. Our motor cortex that allows for our movement is in our frontal cortex, so our movement can be more voluntary, intentional. And then our sensory cortex is happening in that parietal lobe. The occipital lobe is associated with processing our vision and our visual pathway, and there is still very much a lot of synaptogenesis happening in that visual cortex, that occipital cortex, because babies are born with kind of blurry vision, and we'll talk more about that. And so that it's the least developed sense in prenatal development. And so they come out with a little bit blurry vision. Now that makes sense because they're just in a dark womb, right? They don't need their vision. And so that experience interacting and engaging with the world stimulates development in that brain region. And then finally, the temporal lobe, which is right along our ears, which is great because there's the Wernicke's area, which is labeled here as the auditory cortex. So we have the Broca's area, which is responsible for speech production, and the Wernicke's area, which is responsible for comprehension, understanding speech. So know your lobes. Your cerebellum, also known as the 5th lobe sometimes, is actually looking at coordinating movement, smoothness of movements. So this is an important part of the brain. I'm kind of clumsy, so I've got to wonder if my cerebellum didn't fully develop or had some damage. Another part of physical development that's important in infancy and toddlerhood is sleep, right? It's important throughout life, really, but particularly for our little newborns. They sleep about 16.5 hours a day. That's a huge chunk of the day. Nothing's wrong with babies for sleeping that much. It takes a lot of energy to process all that new complex data, right? And a lot of that is done in REM, which is our rapid eye movement sleep. And about 50% of the time that they're asleep, they are spending it in a REM cycle. So it's not uncommon that you're going to see their little eyes fluttering around and maybe them shake around. Sometimes we see our dogs kind of jerk around a little bit in their sleep and their eyes are fluttering. They might even bark a little bit. Our babies and infants will do the same thing. That's going to decrease over time. Both the amount of sleep and the amount spent in REM continues to decline over time. And in toddlerhood, they're sleeping fewer hours, needing fewer naps, but still need naps nonetheless. Now, moving on to a, kind of a sad and disheartening topic is infant death. And so it's not common, but it's still common enough to warrant education, attention, and to be alert, right? And so we want to be mindful of what we call sudden, unexpected infant death. And 3,500 infants die every year in the United States unexpectedly, with no clear cause of death. So sudden infant death is the most common reason for those deaths, and that's when an infant dies within that first year of life, and they unfortunately are not able to find any clear reason for that death through an autopsy. So the nature of the death is inconclusive. Now, typically, we look at correlational factors, and we do know smoking is a correlate with SIDS. We do know both smoking in pregnancy and in the household, even exposure to secondhand smoke, even exposure to someone who's been exposed to secondhand smoke is increasing the risk. It's quite likely suffocation or some sort of regulatory issue with their breathing. That brainstem also needs time to develop, and there might be some abnormalities in the brainstem where it's not regulating their breathing appropriately. So healthy nutrition, watching them, monitoring them, because suffocation is also a primary factor in why infants die in that first couple of years. You want to keep the bed free of extra soft bedding. You don't want to have loose blankets in there with them that they could possibly move around and suffocate in. You want to make sure that they're not getting caught in the crib slats. You want to make sure you don't have any pillows in there. Also, we're used to bundling our babies, but make sure that they're not too hot. That also might throw off their brainstem functioning as well. But many of the deaths are unknown, and that means that, we just don't know. They often don't do an autopsy unless it's requested. And so we want to be proactive. Number one, keep our babies safe. And number two, make sure that we're fully aware what might contribute to these things so that we can intervene and prevent it wherever possible. So breaking down what percentage of those deaths are attributed to what cause, and also about how many occur per year. If you've lost a baby, either through a miscarriage, through a stillbirth, or if they've died suddenly within their first year of life, my deepest condolences to you. Please know that our hearts are with you, and we wish you the best in your healing journey. I'm sure that lingers and stays with you throughout a lifetime. So much love and comfort and aloha to you. So co-sleeping is actually thought to increase the risk of infant death, predominantly because a parent might roll over on the child. So co-sleeping is when the child is sleeping in the bed with you. And in infancy, sadly, it increases the risk of the infant dying. I do want to be mindful and talk about, this is very much cultural. We sleep in soft beds, and that has something to do with it. In other cultures where they sleep in hard beds, floor mats, They co-sleep on a regular basis, and they don't have the same type of infant mortality that exists because of it. And co-sleeping has all kinds of social and emotional benefits. It's been associated with higher cognitive functioning, a greater attachment to the parent, a greater sense of self-empowerment and efficacy. Interesting. So sometimes we think we're creating needy children or demanding children or weak children by co-sleeping. The research actually shows the opposite. So while it certainly does increase the risk of SIDS, it actually does have some positive benefits in a lot of cross-cultural studies. So I do want you to recognize there's pros and cons. Make an informed decision that's right for you, your family, and your baby. Now, reflexes are really important. They're critical because they help lead the child to feed and interact, right? So just the sucking reflex in general allows that child to instantly feed. That turning reflex that allows them to automatically turn toward touch on their cheek, that actually helps to facilitate breastfeeding. So reflexes are really important. Eventually, as the child grows, many of them are replaced with actual voluntary movement. And so they're automatic neural pathways with the brainstem and the body, and they don't need any cerebral engagement, no conscious intentional effort on the part of the infant. And so as that brain is still kind of wiring itself, reflexes allow that baby some really important functional capacity. Read through the ones in your book and you can go through all of the different reflexes and what they do. Motor development, when we're talking about motor, we're talking about movement. So interestingly enough, the way in which babies learn to control their bodies and learn motion is universal. So, you know, a baby in China, a baby in India, a baby in Africa, a baby in the United States, a baby in South America, right? They kind of all go through the same progressive steps in about the same timeline. So that occurs in a cephalocaudal fashion, where first they learn how to hold their head, they strengthen those muscles first, and then they learn how to move the rest of their body. It also starts from the midsection out, proximal, distal, proximal being midline, distal being out, right? Extensions to the hands. So they'll learn how to move their arm before their fingers, right? And they'll be more skilled at flailing their leg around before they can move their toes in an intentional way. My daughter can pick up things with her toes, and she has been able to do so since she was an infant. She has some of the most functional toes. It's amazing. In terms of movement and manipulation, we differentiate between fine motor skills, which is looking at more of the detailed, refined, smaller muscle groups, typically like your hands, and that grasping that is necessary. The pincer grasp is involving the thumb. Others, you just learn to move your fingers first, but that thumb is that pincer grasp. And then gross motor skills is focused on those larger muscle groups, the walking, the standing, the crawling, all of that is going to be a gross motor skill. Senses are also an important developing area. I already mentioned that vision is the least developed sensory capacity that infants have, and they pretty much can't see things unless it's, right in front of their face. And that could be why they're so responsive when you pick them up and you coo with them and you talk to them and you look at them and smile with them, because pretty much everything else is just a blur until it's brought closer to them. They also, because of the contrast, they tend to see black and white better. So it's funny how we decorate rooms with all these bright, beautiful colors, and they really don't see and appreciate that in those first few months. It's not until about 6 months that they have a really functional vision. And then at 12 months, their vision is really pretty well established. They do show preferences. They show preferences for faces. They show when they are looking at a face, they show preferences for chins over eyes. It's not until they get a little bit older that they actually start to make good eye contact with you, and those facial expressions can just be wonderful. They do like patterns over solids, and they like three-dimensional objects over flat objects. Interesting and appealing. Depth perception does start to take shape, so even like reading a story or looking at a picture, if there's depth in that picture, they can see it. But it's really refined when they start to crawl and those motor skills develop and they're interacting with the environment. That really helps to refine their depth perception. So hearing actually starts to develop in the womb at about 6 or 7 months. The ossicles, their bones inside the ears, they start to harden. So through prenatal development, the bones are kind of soft and pliable, and they continue to be actually after birth. The fontanelles, you'll feel that space in the brain, that soft spot, right? The bones are still kind of soft and malleable, and they start to harden after birth. Well, inside the utero development, you actually have these ossicles, these bones, the stapes, and its little partners inside your ear. They actually harden, and they are responsible for processing the sound waves. And so because they harden in utero at about 7 months, embryos and fetuses can actually hear. So they can hear mom's voice if dad's talking to them, or if they have two moms and they hear the other mom's voice regularly. Whoever's talking to them, they're obviously going to hear whoever's carrying them. They're going to hear that voice the most often. But they can also hear the other voices that are talking to them and engaging them. And they will be able to distinguish between those voices and recognize those voices outside the utero once they're born, just as they heard it inside the uterus. They also are responsive to what we call infant-directed speech. So we say, "Hi, aren't you so beautiful," right? And we change the tone of our voice. It's a higher frequency. We tend to elongate our vowels. And that exaggerated sound, they actually respond well to that. When you put them in MRIs, you actually see their brain light up more when you talk to them using that infant-directed speech. They do have the ability to be multilingual, as I mentioned, and that pruning does happen if they're not exposed. Like there's certain sounds in Vietnamese that I don't have the capacity to hear because I was not raised with that language. Even learning Olelo Hawaii right now in my 50s is very different than had I heard it. My cousin was trying to differentiate between I can't even do it right now, but a very subtle difference. And I could not hear it. I couldn't distinguish between, he was saying two different sounds, but they sounded exactly the same. Why? Because I may not have the neural pathways to process that sound. We do have critical periods in language, and that's in the early years of life. So we need to hear the sounds to be able to process them neurologically. And so at about 7 months, some pruning starts to happen, and those neural pathways that offer that capacity tend to thin out. And then again, preferences, we actually do show preferences for, the voice of the person carrying us. We're also showing preference for stories. So if you're one to read stories to your baby and maybe you make noises and sound effects that go along with the story while they're in utero, they actually show a preference for those stories outside the womb as well. Another sensory capacity is their sense of touch and feel, and it's really important to know touch is so incredibly important for infants. They need to be held and loved and touched. There's tremendous research to show the benefits of infant massage and how the brain lights up, and it actually can promote that synaptogenesis and brain development that we talked about. They can feel the temperature, cold, hot, and sometimes they'll cry and let you know when they're uncomfortable, and they also definitely experience pain at birth. And so their responses, we can see their heart rate might increase, their respiration rate might increase, they actually might get lower oxygen levels, and their compensation of oxygen might change, and stress hormones are released when they're exposed to pain. One thing that actually is common in infancy is circumcision here in the United States, and often that's done in many medical facilities without any kind of anesthesia, and that's a problem. That's excruciatingly painful for the infants. They do actually show physical responses to the pain and not just the crying, it's important to make sure if you wouldn't do it to an adult, don't do it to an infant, right? It can actually impact their immune response and system if they're done without anesthesia, and so and it can also impact how emotionally they respond to vaccines. So they can be more terrified of a vaccine. They can be more traumatized by vaccines if they actually were circumcised without anesthesia as infants. So you're building foundations. And then taste and smell. They actually have a great taste receptors, but they're turning over all the time, so they can taste bitter, sour, all of those experiences. You'll see in their little faces what they like and don't like and how they respond to different tastes. It's kind of fun to capture that, either through picture or through video. They do prefer sweet over sour, don't we all? And they do prefer breast milk. Breast milk actually does have a sweetness to it as well. And how we test for these preferences, in terms of mother's face, this isn't just visual, they can actually smell the scent of their own mother's breast milk, and they can smell mother's scent. We all have our scent, and babies are more attuned to the scent of their mother, primary caretaker, or the person that carried and delivered them. And then habituation is kind of a tool that we use. It's really a measure of attention. So when we disconnect that attention, we're said to habituate, right? So it's a decreased responsiveness or attention to stimuli. And then dishabituation is a re-engagement of attention. So it's an increased now responsiveness to stimuli. And that speed with which an infant habituates and dishabituates kind of tells us how quickly they process information and whether or not they attend to information. And so they will focus attention on things for which they have a preference. And so that's how we're able to study infant preferences in these various areas. And we're going to also give you a little bit of nutrition counsel. So breast milk is recommended over formula. Any kind of natural solution is best for infants wherever possible, definitely for newborns. Sadly, the length of breastfeeding is often connected to the time off work. So the average amount of time to breastfeed is about 6 to 8 weeks, which coincides with maternity leave. So it's really interesting to see that in countries like in Northern Europe, where they actually have a longer maternity leave and paternity leave for that matter, we actually show higher average terms for breastfeeding. It's recommended you breastfeed for about 6 months at a minimum, and as long as 2 years, if at all possible. Breast milk is very nutritious. It actually gives them antibodies and all the nutrients that they need. They can actually taste the different things that you're eating as well. And you need to be responsive, because sometimes what you ate might actually irritate your child, or they could even have an allergic reaction to something that you ate. Breast milk is a protective mechanisms for babies, so they actually have lower rates of a number of diseases that are outlined here for you. It also has benefits to both mom and baby. It does make the same hormone that causes the breast milk or the letdown reflex is actually also something that stimulates uterine contraction, so consequently it'll help you get back into shape and drop that pregnancy belly sooner. And fair warning, second baby, third baby, I didn't feel it as much with the first baby, but the second baby, like I was having contractions again when I was breastfeeding. Why? Because it literally is contracting. So it can be painful and uncomfortable initially, but that goes away. It's also supposed to reduce the risk of breast cancer and ovarian cancer. Wasn't helpful for me. I breastfed four babies till about 18 to 24 months for every one of them. And unfortunately, I still got breast cancer. But that might be a family history thing more than anything. Reduces your risk of diabetes and arthritis as well. And so because that breast milk is basically kind of a pathway from what you're eating or what's inside mom to baby, it's not recommended when you have HIV or any other kind of virus or condition that can pass through the breast milk. So really important to talk to your pediatrician, your obstetrician, and ideally if you have a lactation nurse or consultant with them as well. Now that colostrum that precedes the breast milk, kind of that clear, liquidy substance that comes out of the breast, again, it has all the nutrients the baby needs, and it allows you to make sure you're giving the baby a nourishment in those first few days while your breast milk is coming in. And then infant formula, although it's expensive, right? They need that over milk, whether it's almond milk or oat milk or cow's milk. It does not give them all the nutrients they need. So infant formula is packed with protein, and it's meant to kind of substitute for breast milk. And although you do show that babies' intestines are a little bit more reactive to formula, it's still the best second alternative to breast milk. And then eventually, as they get older, maybe even as early as 4 to 6 months, you might start supplementing a bottle diet or a breast diet with solid foods. Often we start with cereal, which is an infant cereal is also protein enriched, and they have extra iron built into them. And sometimes it's, we usually mix it with some sort of breast milk or formula, and that can also help a baby feel more satisfied. It might lead to a little bit better sleeping. If your baby's waking up more consistently and more irritable, maybe they're not getting enough to eat. So look for these kind of signs to indicate if they're ready for some solid food. Doctors also sometimes have like a timeline that they want you to adhere to. And as much as I appreciate doctor guidance, I also say pay attention to your baby, right? And then collectively make the decision that's best for you and the baby. By 10 to 12 months, they're already eating finger foods. We need to also be mindful of the choking risks, right? And we want to make sure we're giving them food that's appropriately swallowed and managed for a little one. So avoid sticky foods, large chunks, anything that can get stuck, hard candy, things of that nature. And then also you want to be careful about giving them any kind of honey or corn syrup, because it could have some botulism spores in them. Botulism spores, it's botulism spores in them that could actually kill them. They do not have the immune system sufficient to protect against those things. Sadly, malnutrition is a leading cause of infant death around the world. Not in the United States, as we saw, but in the globe overall. And that's because quite often in very poor developing countries, they don't have access to clean water, they don't have access to formula. Breastfeeding may be problematic because mom might have diseases that can be passed on to the baby. And so sadly, we still need to deal with nutrition across the globe. Marasmus is in fact starvation due to an inappropriate or, sometimes no food, nourishment at all, or certainly a diet that is not rich in the nutrients that they need. So they start to lose fat and muscle, and their bodies eventually can't function. Interestingly enough, they still have the pudgy belly, and that pudgy belly does not mean that they're full. It's actually a bloating response to the starvation. Kwashiorkor is a disease that often occurs when a child was being breastfed, and then a new child occurs, but they start to lose their appetite, their brain might swell, they actually start to fail to thrive and grow, and their body is just unfortunately almost I'm going to say like a depressive response, right? Like it's just not growing and thriving, and they don't have the desire to eat. And sadly, when your body, as is the case with all malnourishment, it actually goes after protein in your own organs, which is why something like anorexia can actually cause heart damage. So things to think about. And then, nutrition, lack of nutrition isn't just something that affects our physical health, it affects our cognitive, social, and emotional health as well. So let's transition to cognitive development and look inside the brain functioning of these little guys. So Piaget is our most prominent cognitive development theorist. So he suggests that cognitive development happens on a continuous basis. It's a natural maturation process. So you can't necessarily shove all this knowledge and cognitive skill into an infant's brain before they're ready. It will naturally progress just through experience, exposure, and natural biological development. It is important to create a very cognitively stimulating environment where they have rich intellectual exposure, sensory exposure, because all of that promotes neural development, which lays the pathway and provides the framework for the cognitive functioning. The first part or stage of cognitive development is sensory motor. So infancy and toddlerhood is all in the sensory motor stage. And what's most important during that time is engagement. And so we'll talk about the substages, and then the later stages, we'll talk about each one of those as we get to those respective periods. In the sensory motor stage, they go through a series of substages, a total of 6. That first one is just the reflexes. So in that first month of life, they're really operating purely on reflex, and all the exposure and data they're processing is stimulating neural pathway development, and that's synaptogenesis, so that at 1 to 4 months, you'll actually see them not reflexively, but intentionally starting to move their body. So primary, circular. Primary meaning it centers around our own body. Circular in that it continues to be repetitive and circular in nature. So they might suck on their thumb, they might suck on their hand. My brother used to suck on his foot. 4 to 8 months, they move into what we call secondary circular reaction. So now it's secondary because it's outside the body. So now they're playing with an object outside of the body. And it's circular because it is, again, repeated. So they might play with a rattle again and again and again. So they repeat the behavior. Might be done through accidental discovery the first time, like sucking the thumb, and then it becomes more intentional over time. 8 to 12 months, now they start to coordinate those secondary reactions. So they can actually interact with multiple outside objects together. They might move one out of the way to see another or to grab another. So their behavior starts to now move into intentional behavior, where they're actually trying to achieve some sort of goal with those objects. So they're understanding the relationships those objects may have with one another. And then 12 to 18 months, they move into tertiary circular reactions. And now this is showing some what we call problem solving, experimentation. We call this a little scientist phase, where they actually start trial and error. They might push something off their high chair and you have to pick it up, and they'll push it off again and you pick it up. And that's their way of kind of understanding not just the laws of gravity, right? But also, hey, I can affect my caretaker's behavior. I can now cause them to engage me in a way that I want them to. And then in the latter part of toddlerhood, they actually start to have what we call mental representation or early symbolic thought. They actually have memories. They might watch someone throw a tantrum in a grocery store because they didn't get a sucker, and then they might store that, and the next time they're in the grocery store, they might throw the tantrum. Now, during this time, there's also right around here where they start to have object permanence, and they have a concrete, definitive understanding of an object. So even when it's out of sight, they remember that object. So I remember Celine Dion talking about her twins, it was her son, losing like a teddy bear or doll or something in Vegas, and they went on this hunt to find it. And sometimes like the whole world ends if they become attached to a blanket or a toy or a pacifier, and then you can't find it. And when that's happening, that's actually a great sign that that cognitive milestone has been achieved. They know that that exists even when it's out of sight. Otherwise, in infancy, when you are out of sight, they mentally do not know you exist. When you come back into sight, they know you exist. So this peekaboo becomes very engaging for them, and they love it, and their face lights up, and they're like, oh, where the hell did you come from, right? It's a new experience. So peekaboo can be a wonderful, delightful game with the little ones. So again, Piaget, continuous natural maturation. Schemas are the mental structures by which we can kind of store that understanding of that item in the world at large. So you have all these millions and millions of schema that is a framework and a mechanism. I like to think of it like a file folder inside our brain. And then assimilation, we now encounter new information and we just store it into an existing folder. So we file it away into an existing folder. So it's like opening a document on your computer, adding new information, and then hitting save, right? We're just filing it in with our existing understanding of the world or the concept. But then when we engage in accommodation, we're now modifying that folder. We're now producing a new document. Instead of save, it's now save as. So if you all have had the distinct pleasure of watching Monsters, Inc., you have the schema of Kitty. Cute, fuzzy, hairy, little pointy ears, 4 paws, the little pokey claws, a cute little tail, right? This is our understanding of Kitty. And then when Boo sees Sully, what does she call Sully? Kitty. Why? Because Kitty has those little criteria. The little pointy ears, the fuzzy furry skin, the kind of wispy, the tail, the little claws, right? Oh, I'm going to assimilate Sully into my understanding of Kitty. But at some point in the movie, she actually now modifies her schema and engages in accommodation, where now she understands Sully is not a kitty. Sully is a monster. He's separate and distinct. And when does that happen? When she sees him in the scare chamber. And now she's like, oh, you're not cute little kitty. You actually are a monster. And she becomes afraid of him for the first time. Object permanence we covered. And then stranger anxiety kind of goes hand in hand with object permanence, where now I also know not just an object exists when I don't see it, but you exist. So if you're my caretaker, and you're what gives me my sense of security, and you're what takes care of me, when you're not there, I know it. And so I might start to cry when you drop me off. I might also now recognize when I'm in the arms of a stranger, When you're an infant, you get passed around all the time, and you don't care who's holding you, just as long as they're loving you, they're burping you, they're changing you, they're feeding you, right? But when you start to age into infancy and you have stranger anxiety about the same time that object permanence occurs, 9 months give or take, then now all of a sudden you don't want to be passed around. You recognize, I don't know you, and that becomes a problem and a source of fear. Another cognitive, and this kind of goes along with Piaget's theory, in that last substage in sensory motor development actually does show mental representation, does show memory. And that's why we can engage in that deferred imitation, where we see something, we see a behavior, we store it away, and then we model or imitate or reproduce that behavior later on when it's appropriate in an appropriate circumstance, right? Now, interestingly enough, infants don't have memories that they can often articulate or vocalize even now. Like, my earliest memory tends to be around 3-4, and that's very common. For some of us, we can, but for the majority of us, we don't have memories of infancy, and that's what we call infantile amnesia. But it could be biological, because our brain is not mature yet and hasn't developed the neural pathways to retain that information. It could be that we just don't have the language skills to kind of understand, conceptualize, and describe them. It could be that they're in there, we just can't retrieve them. And it could be coincide with our social and emotional development, in that I don't have a full understanding of self yet. And so when that cognitive ability comes online, maybe that's when I have the capacity for autobiographical memory. Language is another important cognitive feature in infancy and toddlerhood. Obviously, language is a tool that we use to communicate our thoughts, ideas, and build our relationships. And so it also, is our way of showing our intelligence, our knowledge, our ability to understand and understand the world. And so when we talk about language, here's some important vocabulary for you. Phonemes is our smallest unit of sound, which is often a letter, just ba, right? A morpheme is our smallest unit of meaning, which can also be a letter. Adding an S to the end of a word means that there's more than one. It's plural. ing to the end of a word is present progressive. It's happening right now. So that's a morpheme. Semantics is referring to kind of the rules that we use to understand the meaning of a term. So when we talk about, it's just semantics, when you and I are miscommunicating, right? And you're using a word, but I'm interpreting it differently based on the context than what you're intending it to be, we talk about that as being semantics. And then syntax is kind of the sequencing of the words and how we order them in a sentence. In English, we say blue shirt, and in Spanish, they might say shirt blue, right? Pragmatics are the rules kind of interaction, the practical rules, like how we take turns. We don't interrupt one another when we're talking, right? And then overall grammar are the formal rules of language, but pragmatics is kind of the informal rules of communication. That can vary based on culture. And then we also have to take into consideration context always, including culture. And infants see that context. They see your nonverbal cues. They see your facial expressions. They see your mannerisms. They see your gesturing. And so they pick up on those things. And they also can feel your tension. So be mindful of that. Even though they don't have language yet, you're still very much communicating with them, and they're communicating with you. So we call this language progression. And so they might just make some odd gurgle sounds, but then they start to coo. They might start laughing and talking to you through laughter by smiling at you, and it just really does speak to your soul. They might actually start to play with their voice a little bit, engage in some babbling. They might get into the single word utterances, which what we call a hollow phrase, right? Telegraphic speech is what we call the 2-word utterance. Is like a telegram, doesn't have the connecting words, so it doesn't sound like proper language, but it is in fact communicating. They might say "j," right? And that might mean juice. Can I have some juice? Where is my juice? Can you get me some more juice? I don't like this juice, right? But they're using a single word utterance or a hollow phrase. And then, let me go back a little bit. They actually also engage in what we call underextension and overextension, where they might apply, I think a word can only apply to one thing, right? So grandpa, like, no, that's my grandpa. They don't recognize that grandpa can be applied to other people too. And then overextension, we see this particularly when they're over applying a word, but also grammar, right? I runned. So they're over applying that ed and to reference past tense. It's really cool to track your child's vocabulary and how it just explodes, particularly in early childhood, which we'll talk about. So we did outline those biological areas for language development, the Broca's area for speech production, and the Wernicke's area for speech comprehension. So as I'm talking, my Broca's area is active, and as you're listening, your Wernicke's area is. And then the critical periods. There was a case study, Jeannie. She was a case of some of the worst child abuse we had actually experienced up until that time. She was treated much like an animal and a savage. She was locked in a cage. There wasn't any kind of language or communication or exchange with her. And sadly, she never fully developed normative language skills. And so consequently, researchers concluded that there were critical periods. If you don't have that language exposure within those first 7 years of life, it could fundamentally alter your ability to communicate and learn language from that point forward. In terms of language development, learning theory would suggest that we develop and learn how to speak and communicate through association and reinforcement, and maybe even some modeling consistent with classical conditioning, operant conditioning, and social learning theory. But it is important to note that these kind of approaches have their limitations. You're not reinforcing children for every single thing, every new word or every new rule they learn. So it can't possibly explain all of language development, especially when you consider the rate at which they learn. And then in terms of modeling, even children of deaf parents can actually learn to speak and learn language. And so they're not getting any modeling. They are certainly learning sign language, but they also can learn to vocalize and hear and engage in oral language as well. And then social pragmatics suggests that it's the social nature of language and that interaction that actually facilitates the learning. We have to engage with other human beings, and so cooperation and collaboration and connection all help to facilitate that language learning. Chomsky is the most prominent language theorist. He actually presented this idea of a language acquisition device, suggesting that we are biologically programmed to process language. It wasn't until years later that we discovered the Broca's and the Wernicke's area, but those effectively are the actual concrete manifestation of his concept of language acquisition device. Chomsky is a real brilliant man. He's actually still alive today. And there is also this notion of deep structure versus surface structure. So we talk about, the deep structure being like the underlying meaning and our retention of that meaning. And we talk about surface structure in terms of like, how do we convey it? And so, just a reference to the different ways in which we communicate. Often we have these universal grammar rules and that are deeply embedded in how we speak and how we engage, but you also might have some surface structures that impact the delivery and expression. Okay, moving to social and emotional development. I do want to talk about infant temperament, and babies are born, it's like a precursor to personality, so they're kind of born being kind of easy, slow to warm, difficult. There was a New York longitudinal study that studied thousands of babies, and they were able to identify kind of a general way in which kind of babies respond to other people, kind of their kind of circadian rhythm and cycle, and how do they adapt to new environments or new circumstances or new incidents. And that reactivity is kind of a reflection of their temperament. And there's 3 general temperaments that were developed based upon those observations. Easy children, which are most infants, which are very adaptable, flexible, kind of easy to comfort, easy to soothe. So overall, just really happy babies, right? Difficult babies are kind of the opposite. Fortunately, only about 10% of babies fall in this category, where they just really have a negative, cranky, difficult temperament. And we talk about often colic, and so colic sometimes might be related to it, but overall they're really hard to comfort, and they might cry incessantly. And then you become more reactive and stressed and challenged as well. And then the slow to warm are the babies that they just need some time, right? They're a little, standoffish, and may not dive right into things, but they adjust, and they might slowly build up some trust and interest in you, and then eventually they might break down and end up having a little bit of fun with you. It's important that It's important that we match our child's temperament, and that we're not reactive to that temperament. We call that goodness of fit. Every child's different, right? Like, I have 4 children, their temperaments are all different, and their personalities are all different. So how I respond to one is different than the others. How I discipline one is different than the others, because what works for one doesn't always work the same way for the others. So something to think about. So personality is that persistent traits, the persistent feeling, thinking, behavior, communication, and state of the child. So it's a stable mood and expectation and engagement and interaction that you can expect, right? And, yes, there's biology involved, but there's also experience. So if they're in a trauma-ridden home where their communication's poor, their needs aren't being met, it can definitely impact their personality. Again, that goodness of fit is critical. It's also important to note that these relationships are bi-directional. And so our personality affects the child, and the child's personality affects us, right? It's both. Sadly, when we have a difficult child, or we might have a child with a developmental delay that's autistic or ADD, sadly, we might become reactive and punitive toward that child. And in reality, the research shows that that child needs more patience, more love, more guidance, more nurturing, more support. So it's really critical. Kind of know your limits, build a really important, good, solid support system, so that when you've reached your limits and you're beyond your capacity and threshold, you can tag out and have someone else step in and help you out. Infants have a variety of emotions, right? They can be weary of strangers. They have that separation anxiety that we talked about. They also have just the gamut of basic emotions that you and I experience. These are the ones that appear first, just happiness, interest, fear, anger. But then they start to develop more complex emotions and self-conscious emotions like pride, jealousy, embarrassment, doubt, shame. Those types of things can sometimes be conditioned and taught, but they're also dependent upon when does a baby have an understanding of self and others. When do I have an understanding that you have a different view and expectation, and I may or may not disappoint you, right? Those complex emotions can't develop until that cognitive understanding happens. So that self-awareness takes time, and it's not until they become aware of what they're feeling, right? Like we want them, they might just be able to cry and throw a tantrum when they're younger because they don't know how to be reflective and mindful of their emotions. They don't understand that self-concept yet or that self-awareness yet. But as they age, we want to get them to be aware of their emotions, to label their emotions, to tell us to use their words to express themselves and communicate. They are going to reference you in situations, right? This is what we call social referencing. So I'm going to look to you if I'm in a situation where I feel weary or wary and of a stranger, unfamiliar, uncertain. I'm going to look to you and I'm going to be like, is it okay to talk to this person? That's social referencing. And it's not until I'm about, 6 months I can start to regulate some emotion, but really until I'm a toddler and into preschool that I'm really starting to regulate my emotion, and the tantrums might progressively go away in early childhood. Attachment theory is one of my absolute favorites. This is John Bowlby, and he talks about attachment as in terms of being a bond with your primary attachment figure, who's often your caregiver. His research and theory was inspired by the work of Harlow, who did a monkey study. These monkeys were pulled away from their mothers, raised with this iron, model of a monkey here, and then they also had an option of a monkey with a cloth over it. And this is where contact comfort came in. He found that the monkeys spent significantly more time with the cloth. Like they need that physical closeness, they need that touch, and so infants need it as well. Babies that were raised without that life attachment figure, they actually had social and emotional deficits that hindered them for the rest of their lives. Now you could have them reintegrated with a loving, wonderful, nurturing, caregiving monkey that could help them overcome a negative attachment, but it took a lot of patience and love for that to happen. So Bowlby's attachment theory suggested that bond forms based on how responsive and nurturing that caretaker is. Are they meeting our needs in a timely manner? Are they loving, affectionate with us? And that creates what he called an internal working model or a template. So it becomes a foundational model for us, a framework that establishes how we engage future relationships and how much attachment or closeness we can have with others throughout our lives. Okay, so I want to also introduce you to Mary Ainsworth. Mary Ainsworth actually was an assistant to Bowlby, and she developed what's called the strange situation. So it was a lab experiment that allowed her to have caretakers bring their child into the lab, which was set up in a very child-friendly way, and then she observed the interactions. She actually had the parent leave the room, watched the child, and observed how they responded to the parent's departure. Had a stranger come into the room, watched the child interact with the stranger, and then actually had the parent, leave and come back. And then that reunification was a critical point of observation. And what she was trying to see is how much does the child look to the parent for social referencing as a secure base? How much do they seek comfort and guidance and nurturing from the parent? And that determines whether or not that child is securely attached or insecurely attached. Now, crying when a parent leaves does not mean it's an unhealthy attachment. It's perfectly normal to cry when your sense of security and your security blanket just walked out the door, right? But the most important thing is, how do they reunify with the parent? Do they seek that comfort? Are they consolable? And so there are 4 attachment styles: a secure attachment, and then the others are all insecure attachments. So there's avoidant, which these people are kind of a secure attachment. Let me go back. A secure attachment is a healthy attachment. It is when the child will look to the parent as a secure base or the caregiver. And there will be that social referencing when they're feeling insecure, uncomfortable, uncertain. They'll kind of go back to, there's almost like this invisible, kind of leash or connection string between mom or caretaker and child. And so that they'll seek that out, or like the tree in hide and seek, that's the base, right? The home base where you're safe. They go to the caretaker for that. Mom leaves, they cry, normal. Caretaker comes back, and now they seek love, they seek affection, they seek reassurance from mom when mom returns. And that's a secure attachment. Insecure avoidant, they may not actually show any kind of connection or attachment to mom even before mom leaves or before the stranger walks in. There's kind of, the relationship seems to be void of any true connection, attachment. They don't really engage in social referencing during that observation period. Ambivalent is like mixed. It's you're hot, then you're cold, you're yes, then you're no. It's that Katy Perry song. It's mixed, right? Have you ever known someone in a relationship and it's like, oh, we love each other. Oh, we love each other. Right? It's that kind of relationship. And where a toddler or, a toddler might cry and scream when mom leaves, mom comes back, and they might, run to mom and hug mom, but they also might smack mom, right? Or they might show mixed messages, like, I kind of know that you're my mom, but at the same time, I kind of don't trust you. And so they have this ambivalence toward mom. And then the other is a disorganized attachment, where they might just engage in very non-normative behavior. Maybe hit their head against the wall, or pull their hair, or engage in kind of repetitive sensory activities. And that might actually, it's very predictive. This attachment style is very predictive of a developmental disorder. Avoidant might actually be, where they're not getting as much parental engagement as would be necessary. And an ambivalent might be indicative of kind of inconsistent caretaking, where they haven't developed a sense of trust and reliability with that caretaker yet. These all are foundational for future relationships that we have. Again, Bowlby suggested we internalize this attachment style, and it serves as our internal working model or our template for all future relationships. So if I have a secure attachment, then when I grow up and I'm in a romantic relationship, I can have a healthy, secure relationship with that person. If I have an insecure attachment and avoidant attachment, I might not be comfortable talking about my emotions, really being connected to another person. I might have walls and barriers up, and I kind of do my own thing, and so we're coexisting, but we're not really connected and attached. In an ambivalent relationship, it might be kind of rocky, very hot and cold, unpredictable, usually unhealthy and toxic as shit too. And then disorganized is kind of pathological. So you think about this. I'll tell you where I made a mistake with Bowlby is Bowlby didn't say, like Freud said, we were fixated. We were kind of stuck and broken for the rest of our lives. Bowlby didn't suggest that. He actually suggested that, let's say I have an insecure attachment. I'm in an abusive environment. My parents are a drug addict, but then I get my grandparents adopt me and take me in, and they provide a wonderful, loving, nurturing, responsive home. Then I can develop a secure attachment. So even if I was damaged when I was young, I can actually learn to develop a healthy, secure attachment style. Opposite can happen too. I can have a wonderful, secure attachment style, but then I experience some sort of trauma or assault, and now it can lead to an unhealthy attachment style. So unfortunately for me, I was like, oh, my ex had an avoidant attachment. His dad died when he was 5. I'm like, oh, he never learned how to love. I can fix that. I can show him how to have a secure, healthy attachment. Yeah, no. Keep in mind when you're trying to fix someone, you might get broken in the process. So be careful about that. But definitely give your babies a wonderful, loving foundation. So that strange situation very much is based on a Western model, right? And not all cultures may interact. So the Q-sort technique is a different way where they use kind of cards, and the observer will sort the cards and then help to engage the client to see how they're responding, and they'll tell you what kind of behavior is appropriate for certain situations. I'm not sure why I needed to pop my ears just now, but I did. So some of the things that impact attachment is consistency of caregiver. And so this is why it's really important for infants to have stability, with not just in parents, right? But also in their daycare providers and their babysitters. They need that consistency. And sometimes, because early childhood education can be grueling work, excuse me, and it's not paid very well, and sometimes, they turn over. And so, Miss Aja's gone, Miss Amy's gone, Miss Mary's gone. You love them, you trust them, you're happy with them, and then they're gone. And that can be emotionally devastating. It can be frightening. So they need that consistency. Imagine if your boss was new every single week or every single month. It'd be scary. And so it can undermine that sense of attachment. Also, social deprivation, where they're exposed to neglect or abuse, that also can undermine attachment and just their overall emotional stability and well-being. They might have a non-organic failure to thrive produced when they're not getting a healthy, loving, nurturing environment. And then, if they do in fact have reactive attachment disorder, where they have been in a very neglectful or abusive environment, and so they have non-normative behaviors, they have non-normative emotions, or maybe they're not communicating at all, and maybe they're not engaging at all, and that could be a disorder more than just avoidant attachment, right? And so we do have to be mindful of the severity of the behaviors and the context under which those behaviors develop and occur to see if it's an attachment issue or is it in fact a disorder. But know that children tend to be really resilient, right? And we can nurture and kind of promote resiliency through helping them overcome challenges and giving them a strong support system, helping them feel safe in the world, helping them feel like the world is a trustworthy, reliable space. And that ties into some of the other theories we're going to talk about. So psychosexual theory of development comes from Freud. And when you're talking about infancy and toddlerhood, it's going to cover the oral stage most definitely through infancy, and through toddlerhood, this anal stage. So, of course, Freud suggested that there are sexual centers and urges and driving forces for development, and oral needs is one of those, sexual urges that need to be met appropriately in infancy. Some might just say they need to be fed. He said, no, oral. They need their own oral needs met. And so if a child is, fed appropriately, and not overfed or underfed, if, that child is given a pacifier and allowed appropriate means to comfort their oral needs and comfort themselves and their emotions, then they are going to be healthy and thriving. If not, they can become fixated, they can become orally fixated, and they might be smokers or nail biters. or they can actually be fixated and maybe not communicate their emotions or not communicate their needs. In the anal stage, now it's centering around the anal needs and potty training in particular. And so if a toddler is given a warm, wonderful, nurturing, supportive environment, they might feel really empowered and they get that sense of self, and so their needs are being met. But if in fact they're being potty trained in a really critical and harsh and negative environment, they might become fixated, and they might just, the parent isn't actively trying to potty train them at all, and they're wearing diapers until they're 6 or 7. Either way, that's still fixation. Remember, with Freud, it's all about balancing these needs, not overstimulating and not understimulating, but balancing. And so an anally retentive person might be strict and rigid and very, type A, and an anally expulsive person might be like, messy and slovenly and, not organized at all. And then we'll address the other stages as those developmental periods arise. Now, because of the sexual nature and the sexual urges concepts, of course, Erickson said, I don't think it's all about the sexual. I want to move away from that and focus on the social interactions. Still focusing on the oral needs, feeding, still focusing on potty training, right? But in a different context, looking at the social dynamics. Are they getting the social support they need? Are they getting responsive, caring, loving, nurturing, caretaking? Are they getting a parent that hears them cry, knows that they're hungry, and is meeting their need in a timely manner? If so, they're going to develop a sense of trust. So the psychosocial crisis is trust versus mistrust. Are they going to get the love and support and social interaction that's going to foster trust or mistrust? So responsive, nurturing, timely caretaking is going to foster trust. Without that, they might feel like, oh my gosh, this is a scary, horrible, wretched world that leaves me hungry and out to fend for myself and all by myself. And they might feel like the world is an unsafe place, and they have this mistrust. In toddlerhood, not early childhood, but toddlerhood, they move into this autonomy versus shame and doubt crisis. I might actually replace this because this should say toddlerhood, not early childhood. Preschool is early childhood. And so you can give them, encouragement and rewards and, empower them to be aware of their body and when they have to go potty. And you can cheer them on and celebrate even when they have accidents. You still want to offer some support and guidance and encouragement and reassurance, right? And that can foster autonomy. Or you can make them feel bad and rip into them and tell them, all the mistakes that they make and harp on them and put a lot of pressure on them and be demanding. And that's going to promote shame and doubt. Remember, this is when the sense of self might also start to emerge, and this is that secondary emotion where they start to have a concept of more complex things like jealousy, envy, shame, disappointment. And so you want to do your best to provide that love, nurturing, and support to foster healthy infant and toddler development. And so with that, I'm going to say goodbye for this particular chapter. And we're going to talk about, or leave you with some thoughts about falling in love with the infant, cherishing every moment, really enjoying all the wonderful growth that's happening. Yes, it's hard to be a mom. Yes, it's hard to be a parent and a dad. It's hard. It's a lot of work. It's a lot of sleepless nights. But it can be wonderful and beautiful and joyous. And for those of you that choose not to have children, that's okay, because you can borrow babies from other people and still enjoy all the benefits and beauty of being around little ones, but have a lot of financial freedom later on in life. And for those of you that would like to have children, but for whatever reason haven't had the opportunity, build a support system, right? And find joy and through the laughter and beautiful spirits of the children around you. Much love and aloha to all of you. Take care.